Have you ever seen this hippo-looking guy before? This is a Moomin, and this little guy is part of a media franchise that makes more than $700 million every year, putting it in the same league as things like Transformers and not far behind Dragon Ball. But Moomin isn't like most other big franchises. For one, if you're American, there's a good chance you've never even heard of it, and we're going to talk about why. Second, the entire empire isn't run by some big corporation, but by the creator's family, who have rebuffed numerous buyout offers from Disney. And third, while you might assume that this is some soulless merchandising empire, it is in fact based on some of the greatest comics and chapter books ever written. So today, I want to look at the history of the Moomins. Why did it become such a global phenomenon, and why did it never break out in the US? Because this idea of Moomin as a global, multi-million-dollar phenomenon was probably unthinkable to its young creator, a struggling 30-year-old Finnish artist named Tove Jansson. In fact, Jansson never intended to be an illustrator or writer. She wanted to be a painter. The expectation that Jansson would become a serious artist was placed on her early on. Her father was a well-known sculptor and her mother a successful illustrator. Through her childhood and early years, she showed incredible promise as a painter and committed herself to studying that craft. Painting for her was a joy, a delight, and a way for her to connect with her tight-knit family of artists. As a young woman, she made ends meet as an illustrator like her mother while working to develop her skill and reputation as a painter. That was until World War II. The encroach of the Russians on one side and Germans on the other would divide Finnish loyalties. Jansson's magazine illustrations from this time make it absolutely clear just what she thought of Hitler and the Nazis, but it severed her relationship with her father, who believed that the Germans were the Finns' only hope against the Russians, and who also had a strong personal dislike of Jews. As the country and her family were being torn apart by war, as bombs fell on Helsinki, Jansson lost the joy and pleasure in her painting. If only painting could help me. I believe all art should be the irresistible expression of delight and insight, a liberation and a need. She continued to make ends meet as an illustrator, but as she said in 1944, for a whole year, I've not been able to paint. The war finally destroyed my pleasure in painting. And so, as a way to escape from this misery, she began to write a fairy tale. But before we get to that, a quick word from our sponsor. Now, you might have noticed there's a new poster behind me over there, and that's thanks to today's sponsor, Displate. So while I unbox these, let me tell you about Displate. I've been getting pretty tired of having blank walls around my house, but since moving in here, I haven't gone to the trouble of committing to some framed art and actually hammering a bunch of holes in my wall. I love change and I'm constantly reorganizing my furniture, and I've definitely spent my share of time spackling over nail holes every time I rearrange a room. Well, thanks to Displate, those problems are gone. Displate makes these durable metal posters that cover a huge range of interests, with officially licensed designs from Marvel, DC, tons of games, movies, and anime, so there's something for everybody. And with their simple magnet mounting kit, it's up on the wall in seconds and easy to swap them out. And now, you can make displays out of any photo you've taken. Upload a photo of your family and friends, apply a filter, and get your own metal image. So what are you waiting for? Use the discount link in the description, which applies automatically at checkout, or use my code MATTTT to get 26% off one display, 31% off two displays, and 36% off 3 or more displays. Now back to Tove Jansson's fairy tale. It tells of a family of creatures who look a bit like hippos called the Moomins, their escape from a catastrophic flood, and the discovery of a new home, Moomin Valley. And here, right at Moomin's origin, is our very first clue to its success. This was not a commercial endeavor. It was written as a pure, necessary self-expression. She believed that art should never be a path to success, and this little fairy tale embodied that. I began writing the first Moomin story when I was feeling sad and scared of bombs and wanted to get away from gloomy thoughts. I would creep into an unbelievable world where everything was natural and friendly and possible. Then I would continue to write whenever it amused me, to amuse myself, but mostly when I was feeling lighthearted and happy. There's another clue here to Moomin's success. Despite ostensibly writing a story for children, Jansson wasn't afraid to inject her real-world fears into this story. There's a threat to this world, to the Moomin family unity, but in the fairy tale, the family stays united, and the great catastrophe doesn't destroy them, but delivers them to a new magical home. See, the Moomin stories aren't simple escapism, but they are deeply comforting. They're comforting because they are not afraid to wrestle with disaster, with sadness, and with melancholy, but they tell us it's okay to be happy anyway. And of course, Jansson didn't just write this fairy tale, she illustrated it. She was already an accomplished illustrator, but now she began to link words and images together in a way that would come to define her career. She added this ink wash over her precise penwork, giving the whole thing this layer of gloom and moodiness, which really matches the tone of the work. Of course, there's also lots of her characteristic humor throughout it all. She submitted the book to publishers, it was accepted, it finally came out, and no one really noticed. It was printed in both Finland and Sweden, but it barely sold over 200 copies in its first year. Commercially, the book may have been a failure. but personally, it was a success. Because the joy Jansson had lost in painting, she found in writing about the Moomins. That joy of writing carried her directly into her second Moomin book. She was supposed to be working on paintings for a solo show, but she just couldn't stop writing. In the second book, still written with the war in mind, the Moomin family face another catastrophe, this time an annihilating comet. She mixes the adventure stories she loved with her fairy tale approach, along with her melancholy humor and comfort. The result is this special kind of whimsy in the face of total annihilation. And this one even sold a few more copies and got a few positive reviews across Sweden and Finland. But even if society didn't have Moomin fever yet, Jansson did. The mild commercial reception of the Moomins didn't seem to affect her at all, which again I think is so important in making the Moomins unique. Like, when we think of huge media franchises, they've almost all been created in some sort of collaborative environment, either by employees under work-for-hire arrangements or creators guided by editors, publishers, collaborators, but Moomin is the opposite. Here's a woman, a decided loner who dreamed of one day having her own island, alone in her studio, processing her fears and anxieties into comedy, handling every aspect of the books herself, down to setting the text and images together. This might be the most deeply individualistic work to ever make billions of dollars. With the war over, Jansson's third Moomin book presents a new aspect, as she'd found a new love, a woman named Vivica. The characters of Thingumi and Bob represent Tove and Vivica, but lesbianism was illegal in Finland until 1971, and so the pair are tormented by this evil monster called the Grog. Here, once again, Jansson places her own life into the context of her art. Her characters face obstacles, they feel fear, but they persevere and find joy in the face of danger. And her art mirrors this evolving aspect to her work, as the inkwash from the earlier books disappears. Remember that Jansson was already an accomplished painter, so the simplicity of these drawings is the work of an artist exhibiting a massive amount of self-control and intentionality, a master of color choosing to work in black and white. It's this relentless pursuit of simplicity and iconography that charges these drawings with feeling and meaning. Also, by this point, she'd really refined her ability to mix words and imagery, as she would later write, in places where the writer skips over something so that it will not disturb his text, the illustrator can fill the gap. The illustrator can leave out pictures that might disturb the child's imagination, but sometimes lines and surfaces can say more than words. Unfortunately, her publishers were still sitting on unsold piles of her first two Moomin books and turned down this third one. But luckily she found a new publisher, and this book was well reviewed and a solid commercial success in both Finland and Sweden. The Moomins were catching on, at least close to home. Jansson would soon make a popular and well-received Moomin play, as well as a stunningly beautiful and equally popular full-color picture book. The fourth chapter book soon followed, this one in the form of the Memoir of Moominpappa, the father of the family. Once again, Jansson works to untangle a difficult, deeply personal subject, her relationship with her own father and fathers in general, and puts it into her sly, humorous, adventurous narrative. It's fun and funny, but once again, all the humor and whimsy is built on the scaffolding of the sadness of real life. There's really something special about the warmth of the Moomin books. In a way, they're like a good friend. The kind of friend who doesn't pretend that your problems don't exist, but acknowledges that what you're going through is real and difficult, but gives you a hug and reminds you that everything is going to be okay anyway. Now, it's important to note that Jansson wasn't just an artist, but a savvy businesswoman. She had seen the success of the merchandising around Lil Abner's Shmoo character, and early on was already envisioning similar success for Moomin. She had hoped that the Moomins would be a hit in the USA, and in 1950, a Moomin book was published in English, but the Moomins failed to charm American audiences the way they had in Finland and Sweden. But that English publication would have a profound impact, because at some point, Englishman Charles Sutton read that book and had an idea. Why not turn the Moomins into a comic strip? He wrote a letter to Jansson in 1952 and suggested she could use a comic strip to do a more mature and adult-oriented version of these characters, and the idea intrigued her. Despite the regional success of her books, her finances were still in a difficult place, and she was on the verge of eviction from her studio. A comic strip would be a regular job for her, a steady income, and could help her advertise her books to a new English-speaking audience. But negotiations wouldn't be easy. Despite her desperate financial situation, she stuck to her guns and fought for what was owed to her. She wouldn't give up her characters, her control, or royalties if she didn't have to. This is so important. There's this idea that legitimate artists, like real self-expressive artists like Jansson, have to be bad at business, bad at numbers and math and negotiating. But Jansson proves that it's possible to be both a true artist and a great businesswoman. After 2 years of painful negotiations, Jansson and Sutton placed the Moomin strip with the London Evening News, the most popular paper in all of England. And on September 20th, 1954, the Moomins would suddenly be in the hands of millions of readers across England. This strip is my favorite version of the Moomins. Jansson had been working, in many ways for her whole career, to find the perfect interplay between words and pictures, from purely visual mediums, illustrations, chapter books, picture books, plays, but finally, in a comic strip, she could bring all of those abilities into balance and could truly breathe life into her wonderful drawings. Now, others might disagree with me, but this is a comic channel, so I'm biased. Like many comics, the Moomin strip immediately has this inherent tension between the ongoing and the episodic, and it creates this very wonderful little rhythm. Each daily strip is a perfect narrative of 2 to 4 images, often focused on a simple gag or powerful image, but Jansson then weaves these gags into story arcs lasting months, layering absurdity onto absurdity into a mad cacophony. Her drawings in these strips are absolutely sublime. They're deceptively simple, as each panel is perfectly graphic, a piece of image and text strong enough to stand on its own, but then empowered by its linkages to its neighbors, which often take the form of simple visual flourishes as objects in the pictures become panel borders. Jean Giraud, better known as Mobius, once commented on the graphic capabilities of Verger, that every single panel in Tintin was iconic enough to put on a t-shirt, and I really think the same can be said of Jansson's work on the Moomin strip. There are single images here that, even removed from their original context, vibrate with the kind of emotional power that only a truly practiced artist like Jansson could generate. And I think that's another key to Moomin's eventual merchandising success. While a Moomin might just be a handful of lines, simple shapes that almost seem childlike, they're the work of a master artist choosing each line for maximum emotional impact. That's why I might pick up a mug with a Moomin and have this mysterious sense of the profound, of the joy and melancholy of life. The artist who made these images accessed her own deeply complex feelings and then allowed those feelings to guide her pen, and that profound vulnerability comes through to us. Or maybe they're just cute little hippos, I don't know. The closest thing in America is probably the work of Charles Schulz, although the scope of his stories never match what Jansson tackles. Carl Barks' Duck Adventures might be a better comparison, but Barks never operated within the same broad emotional spectrum as Jansson. That mixture of fear, anxiety, happiness, melancholy, and joy that are able to coexist within Moomin Valley. And I do think this mixture is something that, as a broad generalization, Americans and American media struggle with. Asian and Nordic media share this ability to shift from tone to tone within a single work, while Americans often seem obsessed with this idea of tonal consistency, where each work has to fit neatly into a tonal box or audiences become confused by it. With Jansson, the adjacency of zany comedy and melancholy, of short gags and long adventures, of simple drawings and complex emotions, it's these very contradictions that empower the work. So it should come as no surprise that the strip was a hit. And I don't mean a small hit. Not only were the millions of London Evening News readers becoming Moomin fanatics, within 2 years the strip would be translated and running in 20 countries, although no newspaper in the United States picked it up, and of course this is a simpler explanation for why Moomin fever didn't reach America. While Jansson had been a successful children's author in her home country, over the course of the next years she became an international celebrity cartoonist. And finally, the merchandising arrived. Figures, soap, advertisements, the strong visual power of these characters hooked readers and they wanted more. The hopes for a Shmoo-type success were an understatement. And through it all, Jansson kept a close eye on the production of everything. Not only was she a shrewd negotiator, but she demanded that all Moomin products be of the highest quality. She would weigh in on colors, materials, creating notes on specific shapes with great precision, anything and everything to make sure that the quality and craft and consistency of the Moomins was maintained. And here's another clue to Moomin's success. The Moomin merchandise is not a monetization of a comic, not a cash grab licensed out to the highest bidder. It's a natural extension of its creator's vision and her storytelling. Through all this, Jansson was becoming quite wealthy, or as she put it in her own characteristically humorous way, "It's going so well, I can't help getting rich even if they keep cheating me." But all of this success would come at a cost. I'm becoming unable to escape any longer to the security of my secret cave. It's beginning to shut me in. The Moomins were born as a joyful escape from the misery of Jansson's reality. Now that joyful escape had become a demanding full-time job. She had no time or energy to paint. She had become a full-time Moomin machine, and the joy of the work was leaving her. But this is Tove Jansson we're talking about, so all of that ambivalence and depression would be fodder for, once again, another great story. It's called Moomin and the Golden Tail, and in it, Moomintroll discovers one day that after the hair on his tail falls out, it grows back as pure gold. He's immediately the subject of interviews and photo shoots. You can feel so much of Jansson's own ambivalence as Snuff confides him, "You don't have to smile, they're only taking a picture of your tail." Soon, his friends are churning out Golden Tail merchandise. "I think I'm getting angry. "I don't want my tail made into lampshades," he says. Then, Moomintroll's manager chastises him for giving away his golden tail rights. "Listen, stupid, you're famous. You need management more than ever." Moomintroll alternates between pride and enjoying the adoration to hating the fame and its complications, torn between his manager and his friends. Eventually, he snips off his golden tail, joyfully prancing in a field of flowers, declaring, "At last, I'm free." But still, that characteristic ambivalence and melancholy creeps into the work, as Moomin still pines for the fame he once had. In fact, it would be the last Moomin strip that Jansson did entirely on her own, before bringing in her brother Lars to help with the writing. A few months later, she'd walk away and hand the strip over to him entirely. She was free, finally, of her Moomin prison. It was an incredible run. But while the strip might be over, Jansson wasn't done with the Moomins yet. And I'll just pause here to say, in case you haven't noticed already, that this is a book that I think belongs on every comic fan's shelf. Personally, I have this big hardcover edition that has all of Tove's strips in a single volume. It's awesome, and it's one of the most cherished parts of my comic collection. But if you want something more compact or something you can share with a child that won't crush them, there are these paperback editions that are nice and readable and are kind of a best of both Tove and Lars' strips. And the Drun Quarterly has also been re-releasing the entire series of books with these really nice matte covers and all the illustrations and stuff. So they're not all out yet, but a bunch of them are. So all this will be linked down below. During the strip, she had somehow found the time to write yet another Moomin chapter book, Moomin Midwinter, inspired by her new love, the woman who she would spend the rest of her life with, Tuliki Pietle. And Jansson, the visual artist, was still restless. For the illustrations in this book, she worked with a scrapboard technique, cutting white lines into a black surface, adding yet another dimension to her art. The book was hailed as a masterpiece of literature for any age and won her numerous awards. But soon she needed a break from the Moomins entirely, and she focused on her painting and writing adult literature. But she felt even as she exhibited her paintings, the public couldn't see her as anything other than the creator of the Moomins. Time passed, and into the 1960s, with great relief, she realized Moomin fever was finally cooling off, and she decided to once more publish another Moomin book, this one a short story collection with a decidedly more adult tone than her earlier works. Besides one more Moomin book in 1965, she spent the rest of the decade focused on her other pursuits. Then, in 1970, 25 years after her first Moomin book, she published Moomin Valley in November. It's an odd book in which the supporting cast of the Moomin adventures come to Moomin Valley in search of the Moomins, but they're not there. They've disappeared. It was a Moomin book without Moomins, a work in which each character has to wrestle with the nature of that absence. Once again, it's a gesture of extreme kindness from Jansson as she helps us prepare for the disappearance of the Moomins. And it would be Jansson's last Moomin-related work, a pointed farewell to the creatures who had defined so much of her life. Afterwards, she turned to her painting and a successful career as a writer for adults, but I don't know how to read books without pictures, so I won't be covering those. But the Moomin story was still far from over. The Janssons kept the Moomins in the family as Tove and increasingly her brother Lars oversaw the continuance of their media and merchandising empire, and soon this would take them to Japan. Tove had first visited Japan in 1971, when the books were first being printed there, and she noted the similarities between Finnish and Japanese culture. Upon release, the Japanese public embraced the Moomins. In a way, the same things that seemed to alienate American readers, the cuteness, the silliness, the mixture of genres, appealed to the Japanese public. That close relationship between the two countries would eventually result in a Moomin anime, made with heavy involvement from Tove and especially her brother Lars. Released in 1991, this show became a huge hit around the world and led to another massive wave of Moomin fever and created an entirely new generation of Moomin fans. I'd never actually seen the show before making this video, but oh my goodness, does it have like the perfect 90s anime vibes. I can see why it became such a hit. It nails that mix of sweetness with mischief, satire, and outright horror and trauma that makes Moomin so special. Of course, no US broadcaster picked it up for distribution outside of Hawaii, so we missed yet another wave of Moomin fever. But it's easy to see how millennials around the world raised on this show, especially in Japan, are now the generation with disposable income to drop on every kind of Moomin merch imaginable. It's in the wake of this show that we have Moomin museums, Moomin theme parks, Moomin everything. But through it all, the brand has been managed by Tove and, after her death, Lars and then his descendants. The Janssons repeatedly turned down buyout offers from Disney, and the Moomins have continued to be a family affair that honors Tove's vision. In her Moomin work, Jansson tried to capture the combination of happiness and sadness, sweetness and melancholy, the reality of this thing called life that most children's fiction, let alone adult fiction, is unwilling to engage with. There's almost nothing else like it on the planet, and I really encourage you to check out the comics. And yeah, you might end up picking yourself up a mug. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you want more of Jansson's story, I really recommend Boel Westin's biography. I was able to find a few different books and sources in English, but hers was definitely the strongest, so I'll link to that below. Thanks to AyakuWeb for filling me in on the impact Moomins had on Japan and Hawaii. Thanks to my Patreon supporters who make videos like this possible. I'll put a link below if you want to support the channel, or just join for free and see what we're talking about over there. I also have a second channel now, which I'll link below, where I've been talking more casually about some different artists and things I like that don't really fit on this channel. Thank you guys so much, and I'll see you soon.